Yeah, so the impulse was, I was reading I was reading that chapter on thought and time, and it suddenly clicked in to, you know, what you've seen in the Volution thesis, in the sense that what I was starting to realize, or at least philosophize about anyway, was that the whole shift that happened, and that they've been trying to, Bohm and Krishnamurti in the Uncommon Collaboration book, I can hear them, you know, the describing the search for where did it go wrong, you know, they've been saying, or something seemed to have happened. Why did we end up with this kind of linear thought? And on the one hand, you know, I'm kind of, well, thought in itself is not a bad thing, because it, you know, enables us to distinguish stuff and recognize things for their uniqueness and things like that. But it was about, for me then, how that linear thought became so dominant and disconnected from a felt experience of interconnectedness, basically.
Yes.
And so, as you've, you know, in the Volution thesis, say you've got the Volution thesis, which is kind of a description of the way I perceive life to work in more than a linear process, so more of that kind of breathing process. And that when you apply that then to something like spiral dynamics and take those 8 levels, that octave, and look at it more in that kind of dynamic, one begins to see that how important that shift was from beige and purple, the kind of precognitive, instinctive experience of unity, into the moment that the self starts to separate out and get this sense of individual identity. And my feeling is that was triggered by actually the reading Up from Eden, by Ken Wilber, where he describes this split. And there are a couple of really powerful quotes, one of which I put in that article, that when in the West anyway, we went through that transition, instead of in a healthy way transcending and including, or what I would say in a more organic form, expanding and embracing, that the previous stages we transcended and repressed for whatever reason. So we kind of somehow, through fear of the wild or whatever it was, we weren't able to re-include the felt experience of interconnectedness with the rest of life, pre-cognitive, so a pre-rational felt, just a direct experience, not a rationally thought about experience. And that because of that, all of our development since then has been unrooted, essentially, from that context, where that process of distinguishing oneself from the other. If you don't have the interconnectedness, in a way, that ground of being underneath it, then everything else becomes an object that you can justifiably manipulate, right, for your own ends. And if you lost that sense of actually it being an intersubjective relationship rather than it being a subject-object relationship, then it allows you to create all sorts of pain around you, because you have shut yourself off somewhere from the fact that the rest of life experiences pain and emotion and everything else as a result of your actions.
Yes.
So my sense was that step was also the moment that we moved into one linear time. It was also around then that agriculture emerged and we started planting stuff for the future. You know, so instead of just harvesting for now, we were, for the moment, we were planting for the future, which I say is not a bad thing at all. It's a good development. But when that then linear time comes in, and with it, and this is the point that they were making in the book, that thought and time seem to kind of come in at the same moment. And parallel with that, the distinction between observer and observed, that's a package somehow, because thought is always rational thought, either related to the past something we know and therefore comes from the past, or, you know, thoughts about the future.
Right.
And
yes.
So therefore that, you know, time, linear time, thought, and myself and the other observer observed, when those kind of emerge unrooted in that context of interconnectedness, then you get the kind of crazy development that we've seen humanity go through since then.
Yes.
And the term that I hadn't heard before that they were using, which was, and maybe you can speak more about that, propreocception.
Yes, yes.
Right, which seems, as I've understood it, is more the instant processing of information and response to it without cognitively thinking about it. So it's like the body, you know, it responds, it does things and responds without you going through the rational thought process.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was that. When I was kind of, oh, this thought time piece I hadn't thought about before, seems to fit this, you know, this evolutionary dynamic that I was exploring around beige purple, the kind of survival tribal
yes.
development phases up into the next phases where the ego separates out. So that was something I wanted to run by somebody, basically.
Right.
And the great thing is, not only do you know about Bohm and Krishnamurti, but you're deeply immersed in spiral and integral. So I'd love, you know, your thoughts.
Yes.
Perspective. And there's a number of other kind of, I've written all sorts of notes of things I'd love to go into, but that was the starting point.
Sure. I mean, I've always been puzzled by what I saw as a slight dissonance between what Bohm and Krishnamurti are saying and what Wilber seems to be saying. Because Bohm and Krishnamurti talk about human beings taking a wrong turn at some point. They talk about this quite explicitly in The Ending of Time. Whereas Wilber's model, at least on a initial reading, seems to show simple progress. When you look at Wilber's model just initially, there's no indication of a wrong turn anywhere. You've got levels, and each level is better than the previous one in some sense. It transcends and includes the previous one. And Wilber's quite explicitly talked about how the rational is more highly evolved than the pre-rational, and how, for example, the orange meme was a monumentally beneficial level for human beings to reach. So there was always this slight dissonance, and I think what you said is spot on, actually. I think the problem is, when I look at Wilber's model, he says that each level transcends and includes the previous one. There is this dynamic that he suggests takes place between each level. You transcend, you differentiate, and then you go back and reintegrate the previous levels. But it's not actually, in reality, until we get to yellow, that the include part of the dynamic seems to actually happen. The way things have developed is that we've had a transcend without the include, as you've just said. And it's really only at integral, at yellow, where we go back and consciously include, or there's no real sense of yellow without that inclusion. Whereas the first tier levels can and have existed without that inclusion. And because of that, each of these levels effectively are at war with the other levels. They see themselves as these exclusive worldviews that are conflictual with one another. So what you're saying makes sense. I think this failure to go back and reintegrate the lower levels, which began, I think, in earnest at red, which is the emergence of the ego, could well be the wrong turn that Bohm and Krishnamurti talk about. It's this disengaging from what has gone before, the greater connectedness we see in the lower levels, beige and purple, and then allowing thought to just run away with itself without reintegrating body, feeling, emotion, interconnectedness, community, other people, nature, all of that becomes alienated, and thought just runs off on its own, almost without any kind of without anything to correct it or stop it from going too far.
Yeah, without any context, in a way.
Yes,
I think, you know, I think Ken, when he talks about the transcendent include, is saying that's the ideal model. You know, in healthy psychological development, we would transcend and include the previous, and you do need to differentiate first, but then wrap around.
Yes.
But he doesn't seem to have gone into detail about the implications of this particular step, although that quote, you know, let me read a bit of it again from Up From Eden, is so strong that he has identified it, but I haven't seen him go into it anymore. When he says it's one thing to gain freedom from nature, emotions, instincts, and the environment, quite another to alienate them. The Western ego did not just gain its freedom from the Great Mother, it severed its deep interconnectedness with her. When the Great Mother's repressed, the Great Goddess is concealed. And then he says it's a terrible realization. Look in vain through Judeo-Christian Islamic religion for any authentic trace of the higher touch of the subtle goddess herself. And that would become a perfect and terrifying comment on an entire civilization. So somehow he has described, but I think he wrote Up From Eden before getting into the kind of spiral dynamics stuff. So I haven't seen him make that explicit connection around a transcendent repress rather than transcendent include. But that's, yeah, it seems to be the seems to me to be the heart of the challenge that we're facing. And whether, you know, when you say it's only at yellow that it happens, I wonder if it's, you know, it's only at yellow for us that it can happen, maybe because of the relationship between purple and yellow.
Right.
But it may, but those previous systems might theoretically have been able to, right, transcend and yet include. So I think that in the individual development, you do see that, right? And so collectively, it might have been possible. And I mean, I haven't, you know, I don't know enough about it, but maybe in other cultures before they kind of got stamped on by the Western model, as it were, you might have seen more of those models of transcend and include development. But now certainly it feels like it's that step to the yellow that in the, you know, as I described in Volution, you have the two yin-based models at beige and purple, and then the central four are yang-based because they're all focused on distinction and separation. And then you get the yin back in. And I think that's why when we get into yellow and turquoise, that we then start to connect back to those previous yin systems to integrate.
I mean, there is another possibility here, which is that the dynamic between each level seems to be that as you move from level X to level X plus 1, what happens at every stage is that what was previously subject becomes object.
Yeah.
So, you know, now, so as we ascend the spiral, in a way, we're gaining a greater and greater strength or altitude of subject.
Yeah.
And maybe that greater altitude is also required to be able to go back and reintegrate the lower levels. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can only really reintegrate something when you can see it, right?
Yes.
So in a way, there's what is subject becoming object. The moment that you become the subject and you can see the object, then you can consciously integrate it. The proposal that I put in Volution is that in these, if you've got an octave, that in the first 4 phases, you are actually kind of unconsciously following the patterns that have been laid down before. So you're not so consciously choosing the path. So purple, beige, purple, red, blue, you know, you're following rules, as it were. You know, in blue, you're following the patterns. You're not consciously co-creating with the rest of the world around you. Whereas the moment that you then, this is what we found in the dancing, how those dynamics seem to mirror from the bottom four then up to the top four, is that from the emergence of orange, so that fifth system, you start to turn around, as it were, and become conscious of your role as, in a way, contributing to this, the cosmic grooves, as Ken would say, or the morphogenetic field, as Sheldrake would say. You become a conscious kind of co-creator in a way. Whereas up until that moment, you've just been following the tracks that have been laid down before.
But do you think that's just because of where we are in history now? I mean, if we went back in time 5,000 years or 10,000 years, would we then be co-creators of blue because the blue grooves haven't been laid down at that point? Or a few hundred years from now, would we need to be yellow to be co-creators because the grooves of orange and green will already have been laid down very firmly? So is that where we begin to co-create? Does that change depending on where we are?
So in a way, what you're saying is how I would interpret it, based on where we're at. If you take an octave looking back, is that co-creation point axis, as it were, of the octave in a way? And so in that sense, it would be relative.
Yes.
And certainly, you know, what I'm suggesting in evolution is that pattern is, and I split it into 4 phases in evolution, but that pattern is an underlying pattern that the spiral is one example of.
Right.
And so, yeah, it might be that that in those, that depending on where you're at, and in a way, it's a hard conversation to have, because my sense is, and this is, you know, what I suggested to Don in one of the early spiral dynamics trainings, is that the spiral dynamics model came out of yellow, right?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Yes,
and therefore, as we move beyond yellow, the whole model becomes inadequate. So in a way, we can kind of say, okay, so if we're at coral and this, you know, second tier level 4, what would it look like? Well, I don't think there will be a second level, you know, because
I agree.
The octave of turquoise, boom, completes that perspective in a way. And as I think we're experiencing in trying to work this out, you know, just us, but others in this kind of, well, there's something up with this linear time issue, you know, it doesn't quite fit in this linear developmental model, that our whole understanding will change, and spiral dynamics will have been great for helping us get from, you know, through that phase.
Yes.
But then another understanding of how life works would emerge.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I think yellow, the pinnacle of yellow is where cognitive thought reaches its pinnacle and starts to wind down. And I think as you move into turquoise, you're moving into something else, which is trans-conceptual, and which we can't really talk about adequately using conceptual talk. So if we're sitting at yellow, and again, this is, I think, a very tempting thing to do when you are very familiar with Wilber's model, is you sit at yellow and then talk about what the higher levels will look like. But all we're doing is we're projecting yellow onto those higher levels and speaking in yellow terms of what those higher levels will look like.
I actually think what's often happening in those situations is it's actually people pulling in orange.
Oh, I agree.
Like if anybody says, well, I kind of think I'm emerging into coral, and the next phase looks like that, I'm kind of, oh, that's a good example of orange.
Yes. Oh, I agree. And I think when Wilber uses phrases like these holons turtle all the way up and turtle all the way down, in a way, if we take that very literally, that can lead to this kind of, it's what I call stagism. It's we take the presuppositions of a given stage and then impose it on our understanding of the other stages, including the higher stages. But the idea of linear time, I agree that linear time is a construct of conceptual cognitive thinking. It's not inherent to reality. And there is, in fact, no such thing as a view from nowhere from which we can see what... You okay?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, that's somebody trying to call me on Skype.
Oh, okay.
Let me just close Skype down here. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so linear. Yes. So let's not, before you move on, actually, let's just pause for a moment, because that point, I think, is such a powerful one when people feel it and realize it, that linear time is a temporary phenomenon. Yep. It's not a permanent feature of our reality. In fact, it emerged at a certain point in our development. Before that, we didn't experience reality as linear at all. We experienced it as cyclical. And therefore, we're reaching that point where linear time is now an inadequate way of perceiving and engaging with our reality. And we're having to wrap back in that cyclical to give us something that integrates them. Right.
I agree. Yes. I mean, space and time, which is the main framework through which we interpret reality, is, at least in part, a human construct. So as the human mind evolves, our notions of space-time evolve. It's not simply a given that we just see. I don't think anything is. There's no such thing as what I was saying is there's no such thing as a view from nowhere. We're always embedded in a context before we can take a view.
Yeah.
So anything we say, including this conversation, is already embedded at a particular level. And we're only seeing things from that level. That we can't step outside of the whole system and have a look. We're part of the system trying to understand the system. Now, what we can do is to contextualize where we're coming from.
Yeah. Now, yeah. Yes, I agree. And so this question of, and I think of the integration of a cyclical experience of time and a linear experience of time, there's a couple of things that it touches on. Do you know more about this, like this concept of propreocception? Because I think that is what, in a way, they're trying to point to as being the ideal experience of time, or of
I mean, my understanding of proprioception is a little bit different from what you said earlier. Okay. My understanding of how Bohm has used the term is it's essentially being deeply aware of your own thinking process in the way that we're currently deeply aware of our own physical body.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very much aware when our arms and legs move around and our head moves. But with thinking, in perhaps most cases, it just happens automatically and runs away with itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think with proprioception, we're able to feel those thoughts in the same way that we can currently feel our body. So it's a deeper or more expanded sense of self-awareness to include thinking.
Yeah. That's this paragraph Moody has written towards the end of the book, where he says, all the previous forms of observation we've considered represent channels of information about the external world. The sense of touch, however, encompasses information not only about the external world, but also about the perceiving organism. The nerve cells in the muscles tell us how we ourselves are moving or situated. A special word is required to describe this form of observation, is called propreocception, that is, the perception of oneself. With proprioception, we've moved as far inward as it is possible to go in our progressive examination of the physical senses. We have available to us, however, channels of information other than those provided by the senses. Among the most important of these are the emotions. Some would say that the emotions represent the most fundamental of all forms of understanding. Others would say that most emotions are distracting and misleading. But in any case, there can be no denying that the emotions represent an extremely powerful current in our lives. The way I interpret that, so the thing that got me about it was they were talking about physical proprioception, which is basically the nerves, whatever in our body, they immediately process information and act on it. Okay, so there's it's completely in the present, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
when you add that, if a next level of proprioception where we're actually connecting to information, let's say in fields outside of our own normal cognitive knowing, then the feeling I've got is the place we're gonna comes next is that is, Meg Wheatley once talked about this cycle of sensing and acting, sensing, act, sense, act, that we're kind of in a way picking up information as we expand the bandwidth of our mind to go beyond the senses that we normally, work with, but to be able to pick up more information that's out there, that we'll be able to pick up more of that information and kind of intuitively, I guess, connected to instinctive, but different because it's transcognitive. I think that's the difference of just a little kind of bracket here, difference between instinctive and intuitive being that intuitive, transcognitive instinct in a way. That intuitive senses, we will instantly know what we need to do and do it without necessarily having a rational reason to do it, but we'll have a strong intuition and feeling about what needs to be done, and then we'll apply the rational mind to the execution of things. But in that situation, the intuition leads and the mind follows.
Right.
And what's happening now is that the mind is leading, and kind of excluding anything else as valid information. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think this is what, when Krishnamurti and Bohm talk about intelligence, and they say an intelligence leads, and then the intelligence uses thought when required, rather than the other way around. We see this. Are you familiar with Aurobindo?
Not in detail, no.
Okay. I mean, Aurobindo was talked about levels of evolution as well, which correlate quite well with Wilber's model.
Yeah.
And he talked about the development of the higher mind, or even the overmind, which he describes exactly as you've just described, that there's a higher mind or overmind emerges, which can see things at a glance, and then it can use the mind where required for the practical outworking of that.
Yeah.
Yes, that makes sense. And maybe that's the kind of thing that starts to come on board at Turquoise, because because then you can see yellow as object. And if the cognitive mind winds down in yellow, Turquoise can then see the cognitive mind as object. But Turquoise itself is something beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes complete sense. And it's really, as you said, that when yellow reaching its limit, that was our experience when we were at the Center for Human Emergence here in the Netherlands. We'd started on these big, around the Millennium Development Goals, a big complex project doing meshworking. Don would talk about meshworking. We were trying to meshwork 20 different organizations who were trying to work on maternal and newborn health, which is one of the Millennium Development Goals. And that system is so huge that, we basically, what we realized is that we were trying to match complexity with complexity, and it was getting so much, it was just too much. But at that point, we got a kind of collective intuition that there must be a simplicity the other side of the complexity that would enable that to become object, as it were. But then what's that? Right. And that was then we were kind of, if we go back to spiral, then, that would obviously be turquoise. So what is that? And that's so we actually had a direct experience of what you're saying. And that's why systems thinking, that talks about trying to map the whole system. Well, you can never map the whole system. No. You can never map the whole system, and you can never predict exactly what's going to happen, however much of the system you've mapped, because there's so much of reality that we can't map. Right?
Yes.
Also in the invisible dimensions.
And also you can't map the one who's doing the mapping. There's a subject who's outside of the map. Yeah. Yes. I mean, what I liked about your evolution model here is that you're pairing up. The way I see it is that what you're saying is that the transrational levels, orange onwards, they kind of they're transrational versions, if you like, of the previous pre-rational levels.
Yeah. And
that can give us a very good insight into what these higher levels might actually be. So if turquoise is a kind of transrational revalorization of beige,
it's
a kind of higher order unity that emerges.
Exactly. Exactly. And my experience of doing energy work is that when you're working with energy, it's not something you don't pick up the information through your rational mind. You actually pick it up through your body.
Yes.
So when you're dowsing, for information, it's nothing to do with the pendulum. So people buy all these fancy pendulums. Nothing to do with the pendulum. They're micro movements in your body that determine. It's an agreement you make with your body. Your mind makes with your body and says, okay, yes or no. Yes, turn right. No, turn left. So to be able to access and work with the information that becomes accessible to us at Turquoise, we have to reintegrate the body.
Absolutely.
So that's the turquoise beige.
Yeah.
A mirror.
Absolutely. I think that's right. Yeah. I think turquoise, a large feature of turquoise is in the body-mind integration.
Yeah.
And once you have a fully, what Wilbur refers to as a centaur, you have a fully integrated body-mind, a full integrated organism, then the mind, the rational mind, is just a part of that. It's just one organ, if you like. It's like you wouldn't reduce your whole life just to your right hand. That's just one small part of your body. So the rational thinking mind just becomes part of this entire organism, which emerges at turquoise, and that's your new sense of identity, the whole organism.
Yeah, and then you see, that's my sense, is that at that point, Chris, the seed that sprouted, at beige and has gone through these different levels becomes this fruit that is kind of crystallized at turquoise, that in itself then becomes the seed for something else.
Right, exactly.
And we just can't even pretend that we're able to describe that because we're so immersed in our current language. And that's the other thing, by the way, that I'm curious about is I think when that shift happened from purple beige into red and beyond, that with that came language to match thought and linearity. And my experience the last few years has been, language as we have it now, in a way, is we label stuff, and that labeling kind of creates an object of it, right? And actually breaks the relationship. Whereas when we were practicing, let's say, healthy magic, we were using language that was actually resonating with life around us, that enabled us to co-create with it, and therefore influence in a co-creative way the world around us. And probably through sound and resonance, or if you look at some of the old Celtic languages that I've spent a little bit of time looking at, the language actually, the place names often actually describe, the features of the place. So the language actually helped you build a relationship with something, rather than our current language that actually creates separation between us and the thing. And so I've got a book on my pile, which is, I think, Language and the Goddess, or something like that apparently describes this process that I haven't looked at yet. But that's another thing. The language, time, language, time, space. I mean, our whole bubble really that we're in, I think, was determined by that moment of
yes. I mean, I think in language, the sharp distinctions we make between subject and object, between noun, adjective, and verb, these very hard distinctions we make, they then determine our reality. We look at the world through those language structures, and then the world we see reflects back our own language structures to us.
Yeah. And really, ultimately, nothing is an object, right? Because everything is everything is ultimately intersubjective.
Yes.
Right. If you take this observer, if we reconnect observer and observed, then object, subject object disappears as a concept, right?
Right.
Yeah.